Korean Mafia boss freezes when a maid's baby crawls into his office and calls him Papa. You have exactly one breath to explain why a baby, in an oversized sweater, just crawled out of a private elevator and called Seoul's most feared crime Lord Papa. Jaehyun's voice didn't rise. It never needed to. Men who controlled the city's shadows had learned long ago that silence killed more efficiently than shouting. The 23rd floor of the glass tower overlooking the Han River was his domain. No cameras, no clearance, no children. Ever. I'm so sorry. Amina's voice shattered the stillness as she stumbled through the doorway, her cleaning uniform still wet from mopping the corridor. Please. I turned around for 1 second. She crawled so fast. The rest of her apology dissolved into terror. Because the child sitting at Jaehyun's feet, beneath the desk where empires crumbled with a signature, looked up at the man they called the silent boss with eyes that knew nothing of fear. And then Zara smiled, drool glistening on her chin, and reached up with both tiny hands toward the man whose word decided who lived and who vanished. Papa. Jaehyun's hand, which had been holding a pen worth more than most people's cars, went completely still. His jaw tightened, the only crack in the mask he wore like armor. His eyes, dark as midnight water, locked onto the child with an intensity that had made generals confess. What? He whispered, each word falling like ice into silence. Did that child just say? Amina's heart hammered against her ribs because she could see it now in the cold morning light flooding through floor-to-ceiling windows. The way Zara's eyes were the same deep brown. The way her nose had that same delicate bridge. The way her brow furrowed with the same focus as she gripped his chair leg, determined and fearless. No, can't be. It was only 1 month. Welcome to the story. If you're ready to see what happens when Seoul's most ruthless boss meets the daughter he didn't know existed, drop a like and tell us in the comments. Would you forgive a man who walked away? Let's find out together. Jaehyun didn't move. He sat in the leather chair that cost more than Amina would earn in 3 years of cleaning blood-free offices. This room occupied the entire top floor of the building. A sanctuary within a fortress where even his most trusted men entered only by invitation. The temperature was kept deliberately cold. Cold kept people alert, kept them from forgetting where they stood, kept them remembering that this was where fortunes ended and futures died. Jaehyun was 31 years old, handsome in a way that made people think of knives hidden in silk, and known throughout Seoul's underworld as the man who never needed to raise his voice. He'd built his reputation at 25 when he'd quietly dismantled a rival organization by turning their own structure against them. No bodies, no evidence, just disappeared accounts and scattered families. He didn't just eliminate problems. He erased them so thoroughly that people forgot they'd ever existed. Today was supposed to be routine. He was finalizing a contract acquisition, the kind that required 3 shell corporations and 2 offshore accounts. The folder on his desk contained legal documents that were anything but legal, printed on paper so expensive it felt like cloth. He had a fountain pen in his hand, German-made, the kind that made signing questionable deals feel like art. But then the elevator had opened. Not with the sharp ding his security team monitored. Not with the cautious hesitation of someone who understood the floor's significance. Just opened. A soft mechanical whisper. Jaehyun had expected his head of security or perhaps his accountant bringing quarterly reports. Instead, he saw nothing at standing height. He looked down. Crawling across the marble floor, imported Italian marble he'd selected because it showed no stains, was a baby. The child wore an oversized cream sweater that dragged behind her like a cape, colors soft and innocent against the room's steel and glass aesthetic. Zara had tight curls that bounced with each determined crawl, and skin that glowed like honey in morning light. She didn't look lost. She looked like she'd found exactly where she wanted to be. Jaehyun had watched, frozen by sheer impossibility, as Zara crawled past the abstract painting that hid a wall safe containing enough blackmail to topple 3 politicians, past the crystal sculpture that was actually a panic button, past the conference table where he'd negotiated treaties between warring factions, right up to the massive desk where Seoul's underworld bent to his will. Zara grabbed the leg of his chair. The leather was Italian, stitched by hand, worth more than most people's monthly rent. Now it was being gripped by fingers still learning coordination. The baby used his chair as leverage, pulling herself up on wobbly legs that barely held her weight. She achieved standing. She beamed, a wet, joyful expression of pure triumph. And then she said the word that shattered his entire world. Papa. The pen slipped from Jayam's fingers and clattered onto the desk. The sound echoed like gunfire. His security team froze in the doorway. Even the morning light seemed to hold its breath. Because Jayam was staring at the small crescent-shaped birthmark near Zara's left ear. A mark he'd seen only once before, 3 years ago, in a hospital corridor he'd walked away from, on a rainy night when he'd convinced himself he couldn't be a father in this life. The child in front of him was impossible. But she was also undeniably his. Because Jayam was staring at the small crescent-shaped birthmark near Zara's left ear. A mark he'd seen only once before, 3 years ago. In a moment he'd buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it never happened. 3 years earlier, Amina had arrived in Seoul with 2 suitcases and a work contract that promised cleaning jobs in prestigious business offices. The agency never mentioned the buildings had no signs, or that the businessmen wore shoulder holsters under their suits, or that some offices smelled like fear beneath the bleach. She took a second job at a cafe near Itaewon to make ends meet. Night shifts paid better, and the owner didn't ask questions about her visa status. Most customers were drunk tourists or couples seeking privacy. She learned to be invisible while wiping tables and pretending not to hear conversations. Then he started coming in. Always alone. Always ordered tea, never alcohol. He sat in the corner booth with newspapers he never seemed to read. He called himself June, just June, no family name. He had quiet eyes and careful hands. The kind of man who looked like he was hiding from something but didn't want to talk about it. "You're not from here," he'd said one night, his Korean awkward but gentle. "West Africa," she'd replied, surprising herself by answering. "You, Seoul. But sometimes I wish I wasn't." It became routine. He'd arrive near closing time. They'd talk while she cleaned. He never asked where she lived or why she was alone. She never asked why a man who dressed in expensive clothes drank cheap tea in a quiet cafe at midnight. He told her he worked in logistics. She told him she missed home. He listened, really listened, in a way that made her feel less invisible. And slowly, carefully, she started to trust the sadness she saw in his eyes. The night everything changed. Rain trapped them inside together. The cafe's metal shutters were already down. Water hammered the streets like drumfire. June had offered to wait with her until it stopped. They'd sat across from each other in the dim light, and for the first time he'd smiled. A real smile, unguarded and young. "I don't know who I am anymore," he'd whispered. "Then be someone new," she'd said. "Just for tonight." He'd reached across the table and held her hand like she was something precious. That night became a week. A week became a month. He never took her to his home, but he rented a small apartment where they could pretend the outside world didn't exist. Where he was just June and she was just Amina, and nothing else mattered. Then one morning he was gone. No note. No good billet. The apartment key left on the counter. The phone number he'd given her disconnected. Like he'd never existed at all. Amina discovered she was pregnant 2 weeks later. She'd cried in a clinic bathroom, holding a positive test and wondering if she'd imagined the entire relationship. But Zara was real. Born 7 months later with curls and curious eyes, and that small crescent birthmark that Amina had kissed 1,000 times, pretending it wasn't a reminder of abandonment. She'd named her daughter Zara, flower in Arabic, because even pain could bloom into something beautiful. Present day. "I said remove the child," Jayam whispered, but his body betrayed him. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't reconcile the man he'd been with the man he'd become. The guards hesitated, looking between their boss and the baby gripping his chair. "Everyone out," Jayam said quietly. "Now." They cleared the room in seconds. Only silence remained and truth. Amina stood frozen in the doorway, her cleaning uniform a cruel echo of every power imbalance between them. "You left," she said, her voice shaking but steady. "You didn't even say goodbye." "I protected you," Jayam replied, still not looking at her. My world destroys everything it touches. You erased us. Amina's hands clenched into fists. I was alone in a foreign country, pregnant, terrified, and you just disappeared. Because if they knew, his voice cracked. If anyone knew I had a weakness, they would have used you, hurt you, killed you both. So instead you let me raise your daughter in poverty? Let me clean the floors of your building while you sat up here pretending we never existed. Zara, oblivious to the storm breaking around her, began clapping and giggling. She crawled between them, her tiny hands patting the marble like it was a drum. Jayam finally looked at Amina, really looked, and saw 3 years of exhaustion written across her face. 3 years of doing it alone. 3 years of surviving what he'd walked away from. June, she whispered, testing the name. Was any of it real? Or was I just another person you erased? He knelt down slowly, eye level with Zara. The baby reached for him fearlessly, grabbing his tie with sticky fingers. Something twisted in his chest, regret, maybe, or recognition. Everything with you was real, he said quietly. That's why I left. Amina's breath caught. That doesn't make sense. June was who I wanted to be. Jayam is who I am. He stood, still holding Zara's tiny hand. I couldn't bring that man's life into yours. Silence stretched between them like a chasm. Then Amina asked the question that changed everything. Why did you really leave? Jayam set Zara down gently, his hands trembling in a way they never had while signing execution orders. Because I was at the hospital, he said, the words scraping out of him like broken glass. 3 years ago, I stood in that corridor outside the maternity ward and watched them clean her, watched them weigh her, watched them put that little bracelet on her wrist. Amina's breath stopped. You were there. I held her. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. For exactly 90 seconds. Long enough to memorize her face. Long enough to understand what I had to do. Which was abandon her? Which was save her? Jayam turned away, staring out at Seoul's glittering skyline. A city he controlled through fear and money. My life isn't meetings and contracts, Amina. It's blood. It's children recruited from slums because they're hungry enough to kill. It's women paid to forget they ever met me. Every person who gets close to me becomes a target or a weapon. He pulled out his phone, pulled up a photo he'd kept encrypted. A burnt-out car in Busan. Family inside. This was my accountant's wife and children. She made the mistake of being seen with him at a school play. A rival syndicate used her to send a message. He swiped to another image. This boy was 12 when I recruited him. He's 19 now. He's killed 4 people and doesn't sleep without pills. Amina looked away, but Jayam continued, relentless. If they knew I had a daughter, she wouldn't make it to her 2nd birthday. They'd take her, use her, send me pieces until I broke. His hands clenched. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let her become another casualty of who I am. So you chose power over love, Amina said quietly. I chose her life over mine. Zara crawled toward a glass paperweight, fascinated by how it caught the light. Neither adult moved to stop her. You don't get to make that choice for us, Amina whispered. You don't get to decide we're safer without you. Jayam had no answer, because she was right, because he'd been a coward hiding behind noble justifications. That night, he did something he'd never done before. He ordered a background check on himself. His head of intelligence looked confused. Sir, everything, Jayam said. Every operation I've run, every life I've touched, every dollar that passed through my hands. I want to see what I look like from the outside. The report arrived at dawn. 47 pages. Single-spaced. Jayam read it in his empty office as sunlight crept across the floor. Money laundering through 17 countries. Front businesses that exploited migrant workers. Protection rackets that destroyed small family shops. Children. God, so many children. Pulled into his world because they had nowhere else to go. And on page 33, cleaning staff contracted through Golden Bridge Agency. Wage. 1.2 million Korean wons monthly. Employee 127, Amina Okafor. Assignment, executive floor maintenance. His daughter had grown up mopping his floors, while he sat 23 stories above her. The file slipped from his hands. The bomb was planted 2 weeks later. Jaehyun had moved them to a company apartment by then, not out of sentiment, he told himself, but logistics. The cleaning agency had complained about Amina bringing a child to work. Easier to house them on site. He'd ordered Zara moved to a different floor that morning on instinct. Something felt wrong. The elevator's maintenance schedule was off by a day. When the service elevator exploded at 6:47 a.m., Jaehyun was in a meeting 3 buildings away. He felt it in his bones before his phone rang. By the time he reached the building, smoke was still pouring from the shaft. His security chief was already talking bomb, targeted, sophisticated, but Jaehyun wasn't listening. Where is she? His voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Where's Zara? Sir. She wasn't. Where? 4th floor. She's safe. The nanny had her in the playroom. Jaehyun didn't wait for the rest. He took the stairs 3 at a time, his carefully constructed control shattering with each floor. When he burst through the playroom door, Zara looked up from her blocks, startled by the noise. She was covered in crayon marks and applesauce. She was alive. Jaehyun dropped to his knees, pulling her against his chest so hard she squeaked in protest. His hands shook. His breath came in ragged gasps. For the first time in 15 years, tears burned behind his eyes. Papa! Zara patted his face, confused by his intensity. He couldn't speak, could barely breathe, could only hold this small, perfect thing that someone had tried to destroy. Amina appeared in the doorway, pale and terrified. They said there was a bomb. Pack everything, Jaehyun said, his voice rough but absolute. You're both moving into the secured residence. 24-hour protection. Armed escort. No exceptions. Jaehyun, this isn't a discussion. He stood, still holding Zara. My world found her, and it's going to try again. The penthouse apartment overlooked Namsan Tower, all glass and steel and space designed for someone who never slept soundly. Jaehyun had moved them in within 48 hours. Amina's protests drowned out by the arrival of movers, security personnel, and a team that installed cameras in every hallway. This is a cage, Amina had said, watching armed guards take positions outside. It's protection, Jaehyun replied. There's a difference. Is there? He didn't answer. He was too busy watching Zara toddle across the marble floor, fascinated by her own reflection in the polished surface. The first week was chaos. Jaehyun had negotiated treaties between warring syndicates, managed supply chains across 3 countries, and orchestrated the quiet removal of obstacles that threatened his empire. But he had no idea how to hold a 2-year-old. Support her head, Amina instructed coldly as Zara reached for him during breakfast. She's not a newborn. Then support her body. She's not a briefcase. He adjusted his grip, awkward and stiff, holding Zara like she might detonate. The child giggled and grabbed his nose. He froze, genuinely uncertain what to do next. She likes you, Amina said without warmth. Congratulations. You get points for showing up. Feeding was worse. Zara sat in a high chair, purchased by someone on Jaehyun's staff who actually knew what children needed, while he attempted to spoon mashed sweet potato into her mouth. She kept turning her head, giggling, making airplane sounds he didn't understand. You're supposed to make it fun, Amina said from the doorway, arms crossed. I'm feeding her. You're treating her like a hostage negotiation. Zara grabbed the spoon and flung sweet potato across the table. It landed on Jaehyun's custom suit jacket. He stared at the orange stain, then at his daughter, who was laughing so hard she could barely breathe. Something cracked in his chest. He smiled, small, surprised. Real. You think that's funny? He asked softly. Zara clapped. Papa Fanny. The word still hit him like a bullet every time. At night, Amina maintained her distance. She'd take Zara to the guest bedroom, close the door firmly, and make it clear that proximity didn't mean forgiveness. You don't get to play father when it's convenient, she'd said one evening, watching him awkwardly attempt to read a picture book while Zara squirmed in his lap. I'm not playing, he replied, adjusting his grip as Zara tried to turn the pages too fast. I'm trying. Trying doesn't erase 3 years. I know. Trying doesn't change what you are. He looked up then, meeting her eyes. I'm changing what I am. The next morning he called his accountant. I want out of the nightclub operations, Jayam said into the phone, watching Zara stack blocks in the corner of his home office. Sell them. All of them. Sir, those generate. I know what they generate. Sell them. Over the following weeks, piece by piece, he began dismantling the empire he'd built. Illegal gambling routes converted to legitimate entertainment venues. Protection rackets quietly dissolved. Shipments that crossed legal lines suddenly found new, cleaner paths. His lieutenants noticed immediately. You're going soft, one had dared to say during a video conference. Jayam had looked at him with the same cold eyes that once ended careers. I'm getting smart. Question me again. But word spread through Seoul's underworld anyway. The silent boss was losing his edge. Weakness had infected him. He'd chosen a woman and a child over power. Jayam knew the whispers. He'd built his reputation on recognizing threats before they materialized. But when Zara ran into his arms one afternoon, shouting, "Papa, Papa," with pure joy, when she fell asleep on his chest during a thunderstorm, trusting him completely, he found he didn't care what they said. Amina watched these transformations with guarded eyes. Sometimes he'd catch her almost smiling when Zara made him laugh. But then she'd remember, and the wall would rebuild itself. She deserves this, Amina said one night, watching through the doorway as Jayam read bedtime stories with a child curled against his shoulder. But I'm not sure you do. He didn't argue. He just kept reading, his voice gentle with words about talking animals and magical forests. So far from the world, he'd known that it felt like learning a foreign language. Later, after Zara was asleep, Jayam sat in his office reviewing contracts for the legal shipping company he was building from his empire's ashes. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Your enemies are multiplying. So are ours. A friend. He stared at the message, then deleted it, then checked the security feeds, then walked to Zara's room and stood in the doorway, watching her sleep with a stuffed bear clutched to her chest. The threats were coming. He'd known they would. He just hadn't expected them to come from inside. The message came during breakfast. Jayam's phone vibrated against the marble counter while Zara finger-painted with yogurt. His former lieutenant's name flashed across the screen. A man he'd trusted with shipments worth millions, now requesting an urgent meeting. He deleted it without responding. Problem? Amina asked, though her tone suggested she didn't really want to know. Nothing I can't handle. But they both knew he was lying. The rumors had spread like infection through Seoul's underworld. The silent boss had gone soft. He traded his empire for domestic life, chosen a cleaning woman and a mixed-race child over the throne he'd built with blood and silence. Weakness, they whispered, was contagious. And weakness needed to be eliminated before it spread. Jayam's sources reported the meetings happening in back rooms of clubs he used to own. Former allies discussing succession. Rivals sensing opportunity. The syndicate he'd controlled through fear was now measuring him for a coffin. We should leave, Amina said one night, standing in the doorway of his office. Take Zara somewhere safe. Start over. I'm working on it. Work faster. Her voice cracked. I've seen what happens when powerful men fall. I've cleaned up after it. He looked up from the documents he'd been reviewing, liquidation papers, offshore accounts being converted to legitimate holdings, escape routes mapped across 3 countries. I won't let anything happen to her, he said quietly. You can't promise that. Not while you're still connected to this world. She was right. He knew she was right. The next afternoon, Jayam sat on the floor with Zara, building block towers she'd immediately destroy with delighted shrieks. Can you say your name? He asked gently, stacking another block. Zawa. Close. Yara. Zawa. She beamed like she'd solved the universe. He tried again, patient, persistent. Teaching her the syllables of her own identity felt critical somehow, like she needed to know who she was before the world tried to tell her otherwise. Za, ra, za, wa. Better. He smiled, and she crashed into his chest with a hug that nearly knocked him over. Amina watched from the kitchen, her expression unreadable. But something had shifted in her eyes. Recognition, maybe, that the man playing with their daughter wasn't performing. He was changing. Slowly, clumsily, but genuinely. That night, everything shattered. Jayam's head of security burst through the door at 2 a.m., his face pale in the hallway light. "Sir, we intercepted a team outside Zara's preschool. They were setting up surveillance." Jayam was out of bed before the man finished speaking. "Who sent them?" "We're working on identification, but..." The guard hesitated. "They had building layouts. Her schedule. Someone gave them inside information." Amina appeared in the hallway, clutching her robe. "What's happening?" "Get Zara. Pack essentials. Now." Jayam's voice had shifted. No longer the gentle father reading bedtime stories, but the cold strategist who'd survived a decade in Seoul's shadows. "Jayam." "Now, Amina." She ran. Jayam descended to the building's security center, reviewing footage of the intercepted team. Professional. Well-funded. Not street-level thugs, but trained operatives. The kind you hired when you wanted something done correctly. "They were going to take her," his security chief said quietly. "Not kill. Take. Leverage." Of course. Zara was worth more alive. A tool to control him, break him, force him back into compliance or punish him for leaving. Jayam's hands clenched into fists. He'd been naive, thinking he could dismantle his empire gradually, keep one foot in both worlds while he transitioned to legitimacy. The underworld didn't allow partial exits. You were in or you were dead. Or worse, everyone you loved was. He made calls through the night, liquidated assets at fractions of their value, activated contingency plans he'd built years ago, never thinking he'd actually use them, burned bridges he'd spent a decade constructing. By dawn, he'd set the final dismantling in motion. No more half measures. No more compromises. He was going to erase Jayam completely and pray that whatever remained was enough to keep his daughter safe. Amina found him in his office at sunrise, surrounded by shredded documents and emptied safes. "Is she safe?" she asked. "For now. And later." He looked at her directly, letting her see the exhaustion and determination in his eyes. "I'm ending this. All of it. We disappear. New country, new names, new life." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay. Okay. You're not June anymore. You're not Jayam either." Her voice softened. "Maybe you can be someone new. For real this time." He wanted to believe her, but his phone buzzed with an encrypted message that made his blood turn to ice. "You can't run from family. Your lieutenant says hello. The butcher sends his regards." Attached was a photo. His most trusted advisor shaking hands with his oldest enemy. The betrayal wasn't coming. It had already happened. The meeting was set in neutral territory, an abandoned warehouse in Incheon where Jayam had once negotiated his first major deal. The symmetry wasn't lost on him. Everything that began here might also end here. His former lieutenant arrived with 4 armed men, their footsteps echoing against concrete walls. The man had been with Jayam for 8 years, had earned his trust through loyalty that now revealed itself as performance. "You came alone," the lieutenant observed, scanning the shadows for hidden guards. "I came honest," Jayam replied, standing in the center of the empty space. "That's more than you did." The lieutenant smiled, cold, rehearsed. "You've gone soft, boss. Everyone sees it. A cleaning woman? A baby?" He laughed, and his men joined in like a trained chorus. "You traded an empire for a maid and a child who doesn't even look Korean." Jayam's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. "You could have had anyone. Models, actresses, daughters of powerful families who would have strengthened your position." The lieutenant circled him slowly, performing for his audience. "Instead you chose a nobody, and a half-blood child who'll never belong anywhere." The insult hung in the air like poison, Jayam's mind flashed back 3 years, to a hospital corridor he'd stood in at midnight, watching through a window as nurses cleaned a newborn with skin darker than his, curls already forming on her tiny head. He'd felt terror then, not of the child, but of what loving her would cost. He'd walked away from that window, walked away from Amina's hopeful, exhausted face, walked away from the possibility of being someone other than what he'd become. And he'd told himself it was mercy, that abandonment was protection, that a girl like Zara would be safer without a father like him. But standing in this warehouse, listening to his daughter being reduced to an insult, Jayam understood the truth. He'd been a coward, afraid of vulnerability, afraid of being seen, afraid of loving something more than power. His hand moved to his jacket pocket. Inside was a photo Amina had taken last week. Zara asleep with a stuffed bear, her small face peaceful and perfect and utterly unaware that men like this wanted to use her as leverage. "You chose a cleaner and a half-blood child over everything we built," the lieutenant said, drawing a gun with practiced ease. "Over loyalty, over legacy, over the empire that made you who you are." Jayam looked at the weapon, then at the man holding it, then at the photo in his hand. "Yes," he said quietly. The word carried across the warehouse like a verdict. "I did." The lieutenant's face twisted. "You're admitting it?" "I chose her." Jayam's voice strengthened. "I chose them. Over all of this. Over you. Over the empire. Over the man I was." He took a step forward. "And I'd make the same choice every single day for the rest of my life. You're a fool. Maybe. But I'm her father. And that's worth more than anything you're offering." The lieutenant's finger moved to the trigger. "You could have been a king. I'd rather be her papa." The shot rang out, deafening in the enclosed space. But Jayam's guards, positioned on the catwalks above, hidden in the shadows he'd known were there, fired first. The lieutenant's men went down in seconds, professional and precise. The lieutenant himself stumbled backward, his shot going wide, embedding in concrete 3 feet from Jayam's head. He collapsed against a support beam, blood spreading across his shirt, eyes wide with disbelief. You brought backup," he gasped. "I said I came honest. I didn't say I came stupid." Jayam stood over him, unmoved. "Tell whoever hired you, Jayam is dead. The silent boss is finished. And whoever comes after my family next won't get a warning." The guards cleared the warehouse efficiently. Jayam walked outside into cold morning air, his hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. He'd killed before, ordered deaths, witnessed executions, made peace with violence as a business tool. But this was different. This was choosing who he wanted to be. He collapsed against his car, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. Not physically, but emotionally, the weight of 3 years of running, hiding, pretending finally crushing down on him all at once. His phone buzzed. A message from his lawyer. Syndicate fracturing. 3 factions claiming leadership. Window closing. Jayam stared at the message, then at the photo of Zara still clutched in his hand. He made a call. "Activate the exit plan. Tonight." "Sir. We're done. Burn everything." When Amina's call came through an hour later, the number was already disconnected. When she checked the penthouse that evening, it was empty. Furniture gone. Security cameras deactivated. No trace of Jayam except a single envelope on the kitchen counter. Inside, liquidated account numbers, new identity documents for her and Zara, and a handwritten note in shaky script. "I'm finishing what I started. Trust me one more time. Yun." Jayam had vanished, and Seoul's underworld began tearing itself apart. The fire started at midnight in 3 locations simultaneously. Not real fire, digital. Bank accounts, shell corporations, encrypted networks that had taken Jayam a decade to build all began collapsing in synchronized chaos. He'd designed the self-destruct sequence years ago, never imagining he'd actually trigger it. But betrayal had forced his hand. By dawn, the syndicate that operated under 17 different names across 4 countries had ceased to exist. Assets liquidated. Records erased. The web of connections that made Jayam untouchable dissolved like smoke. His former lieutenant arrived at the penthouse with 6 armed men, expecting to find the silent boss cornered and desperate. Instead, they found an empty apartment and a note written in Jaeim's precise handwriting. "You wanted the empire. You can have the ashes." Jaeim Kim, the man Seoul's underworld had feared for a decade, vanished that night. No body, no trail, no forwarding address. Just whispers and speculation that faded as newer, hungrier predators claimed the territory he'd abandoned. Some said he was dead. Others said he'd fled to Southeast Asia. A few claimed they'd seen him in Europe, starting over under a different name. All of them were partially right. 3 years later, the shipping company's main office occupied a modest building in Busan, far from Seoul's glass towers and shadowed alleys. Han Maritime Solutions specialized in legitimate freight, electronics, textiles, automotive parts. Everything documented, everything legal, everything so normal it was almost boring. The owner kept a low profile, worked long hours, attended industry conferences, paid taxes on time. His employees knew him as Mr. Han, a quiet man with careful eyes who'd built the company from nothing and treated his workers fairly. Nobody asked about his past. Nobody wondered why a man in his mid-30s spoke like someone much older, or why security cameras covered every angle of the building, or why he occasionally stared at ships leaving the harbor like he was calculating routes he'd never take. At home, life had found a rhythm that felt impossibly fragile and impossibly precious. Zara was 5 now, all energy and questions and fearless curiosity. She attended a private school under a different surname, made friends easily, and had no memory of the night her father had dismantled an empire to keep her safe. Amina had stopped cleaning other people's buildings. She managed the company's administrative office, her sharp mind and attention to detail making her invaluable. She wore professional clothes now instead of cleaning uniforms, and sometimes Jaeim would catch her smiling at something Zara said and forget to breathe. They'd never married. The conversation hadn't happened, though they shared the same home, the same meals, the same silent agreement that they were building something new from broken pieces. "You're different," Amina had said one evening, watching him help Zara with her homework at the kitchen table. "Different how?" "Lighter. Like you're not carrying ghosts anymore." He'd considered this. "I'm carrying different ones now. Better ones." Zara had looked up from her coloring book. "Papa, what's a ghost?" "Something that used to be real," he'd answered carefully. "But isn't anymore." The nightmares still came sometimes. Dreams of betrayal, of the lieutenant's smile before the final confrontation, of Zara's school surrounded by men with guns. He'd wake gasping, reach for weapons that were no longer there, and then hear his daughter's soft breathing from the next room. Amina would find him on those nights, sitting in the kitchen at 3 a.m. "You saved her," she'd remind him quietly. "That's what matters. I almost got her killed. But you didn't. You chose differently." Slowly, carefully, she'd started to forgive him. Or maybe they were both just learning to forgive themselves. Present day. Jaeim sat in his office reviewing shipping manifests when he heard the familiar sound of small feet running down the hallway. His door, never locked anymore, never guarded, burst open. Zara stood in the doorway, backpack bouncing, hair in pigtails, eyes bright with excitement about something that had happened at school. She was breathless and beaming and completely unafraid. She ran toward him, arms outstretched, shouting the word that had once shattered his world and was now the foundation of everything good in it. "Papa!" He caught her mid-leap, lifting her into the air as she giggled. No fear. No freezing. No guards or secrets or walls between them. Just warmth. Just this. "Papa, guess what?" Zara said, grabbing his face with both hands. "I made a new friend and she has a puppy, and can we get a puppy? Please? I'll take care of it, I promise." Amina appeared in the doorway, watching them with an expression that had traveled from suspicion to tolerance to something that almost looked like love. "What do you think?" Jaeim asked, looking at her over Zara's shoulder. "Can we handle a puppy?" Amina smiled, real and unguarded. "I think we can handle anything." And for a man who'd once ruled through fear and silence, who destroyed his own empire to protect a daughter who'd called him Papa in a moment that changed everything. That was the only truth that mattered anymore. Zara's impact nearly knocked him backward. At 5 years old, she'd perfected the art of the running hug. Full speed, no hesitation, absolute trust that he'd catch her. And he always did. Careful, Jayam said, settling her on his hip like it was the most natural thing in the world. You'll knock your old man over. You're not old, Zara protested, poking his cheek. Miss Kim's dad is old. He has no hair. Give me a few more years of your breakfast experiments and I'll get there. She giggled, then launched into a breathless story about her friend's puppy. A golden retriever named Butter who could apparently do tricks and knew how to shake hands and absolutely had to become part of their family immediately. Jayam listened, nodding seriously at all the right moments, while Zara's hands gestured wildly and her eyes shone with the kind of uncomplicated joy he'd once thought impossible in his world. Amina leaned against the doorframe, watching them. The afternoon light from the window caught her profile, softening the edges that 3 years ago had been sharp with survival and suspicion. She looked peaceful now, settled, like she'd finally stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. You're spoiling her, Amina said, though her tone held no real criticism. I'm considering her very compelling argument about canine companionship. That's a yes, then. That's a we'll discuss it. He shifted Zara in his arms. Which means your mother will make the actual decision, and I'll pretend I had input. Zara squealed and squirmed down, already running to tell her stuffed animals the good news about their potential new sibling. Silence settled between Jayam and Amina, the comfortable kind that came from shared history and hard-won understanding. Do you regret it? Amina asked softly, moving into the office. Leaving that life? Everything you built. Jayam looked out the window at the harbor, watching cargo ships navigate the channels with careful precision. 3 years ago, some of those ships had carried things that couldn't survive customs inspection. Now they carried only what the manifests claimed. Every day, he said honestly. Her expression flickered with something that might have been hurt. But not for the reasons you think. He turned to face her fully. I regret the years I wasted building an empire out of fear. I regret the man I became thinking power meant safety. I regret almost missing. His voice caught. Almost missing this. Amina crossed her arms, but her eyes had softened. You gave up everything. I gave up nothing that mattered. He gestured toward the hallway where Zara's voice drifted back, telling her toys elaborate stories about their soon-to-be puppy. That life? The towers and the fear and the control? I thought it made me untouchable. Instead, it made me empty. And now I'm just a man who ships automotive parts and reads bedtime stories. He smiled slightly. Most boring redemption arc ever. You're not bored. No, he admitted. I'm terrified most of the time. Terrified I'll make the wrong decision. Terrified I'm not enough. Terrified that someday she'll ask about who I used to be and I won't have a good answer. Amina stepped closer. You're enough. You show up. You try. You changed everything for her. For both of you. I know. Her hand found his, tentative but real. I see it. Every day. The way you look at her like she's the only thing that matters. The way you've built this life. This safe, normal, boring life, and protected it fiercer than you ever protected that empire. Zara burst back into the office, arms full of stuffed animals. Papa. Mama. We need to make a list of puppy names. She dumped the toys on his desk, completely unbothered by the shipping contracts and spreadsheets, and began arranging them in order of importance for the naming committee. Jayam caught Amina's eye over their daughter's head. Mama. Zara had started using it naturally a few months ago, bridging the gap neither adult had known how to cross. What about Shadow? Zara suggested, holding up a worn teddy bear. Or Lightning. Or Marshmallow. All excellent options, Jayam said seriously. Very professional naming strategy. Zara beamed at him, then climbed into his lap without asking, settling in like she belonged there, which she did. Completely and absolutely. She grabbed his face with both small hands, squishing his cheeks together. Papa good, she declared with utter certainty. 2 words. Simple. Absolute. They hit him harder than any threat he'd ever received. Because she meant it. This child who knew nothing of the silent boss or the empire built on fear or the blood money that had once funded skyscrapers. She only knew the man who made her pancakes on Sundays and read her stories and caught her when she jumped. And in her eyes, uncomplicated by history or knowledge of what he'd been, he was simply good. Jayam pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her curls, and felt something inside his chest finally settle. Not forgiveness, he didn't know if he deserved that, but acceptance, maybe. Permission to be this person instead of that one. Yeah, he whispered. Papa's trying to be. Amina's hand rested on his shoulder, warm and steady. Outside, the harbor continued its rhythms. Ships came and went. Cargo was loaded and delivered. Everything legal, everything safe, everything beautifully, impossibly ordinary. And for a man who once ruled Seoul's underworld through fear and silence, this ordinary life was the greatest power he'd ever known. There were mornings when Jayam woke up and forgot who he used to be. He'd lie there in the pre-dawn quiet, listening to Zara's soft breathing through the wall and Amina moving quietly in the kitchen, and think, this is my life. This has always been my life. Then reality would settle back in. Memories of 23rd floors and marble stained with more than spilled coffee. Of a world where his whisper meant death and his silence meant compliance. A life where he'd been called the silent boss, the shadow of Seoul, the man who controlled fear itself. That person felt like fiction now. A character in someone else's story. Today, his biggest crisis was convincing a 5-year-old that yes, she had to wear shoes to school, and no, flip-flops didn't count as fancy shoes, even if they had glitter. But Papa, they sparkle, Zara argued, holding up the offending footwear with complete conviction. They also have dolphins on them. Your school has rules. Dolphin rules. Shoe rules. He knelt down, helping her into proper sneakers, while she sighed dramatically like he'd personally ruined her life. Trust me, rebellions have been fought over less important things. What's rebellions? Something we'll discuss when you're 30. Amina appeared in the doorway, already dressed for work, coffee in hand. You're going to be late. We're negotiating footwear policy. The glitter flip-flops? She makes a compelling argument about sparkles. She makes compelling arguments about everything. She gets that from you. Amina smiled, then checked her watch. 10 minutes, both of you. Jayam finished tying Zara's laces, then straightened, feeling the familiar ache in his back that came from kneeling on tile floors instead of sitting in leather chairs worth more than cars. He wouldn't trade it for anything. His office now was modest, wooden desk, filing cabinets, a window overlooking the shipping yard instead of the Han River. The door stayed open. Always. Employees wandered in with questions about manifests and delivery schedules. Sometimes Zara's drawings got mixed in with invoices. Once, he'd accidentally submitted a shipping quote with a crayon sun in the corner. No guards outside. No weapons hidden in drawers. No encrypted phones or escape routes mapped in his head. Just normalcy. Beautiful, terrifying, ordinary normalcy. At breakfast, Zara chattered about her upcoming school play. She'd been cast as Tree Number 3 and took her role very seriously. Amina reviewed the day's schedule while stealing bites of toast. Jayam packed Zara's lunch and included a note with a badly drawn smiley face that always came home crumpled but treasured. This was power now. Not controlling criminal empires or commanding fear with a glance. But these small moments. The trust in Zara's eyes when she grabbed his hand crossing the street. The way Amina's shoulder brushed his when they stood side by side at the sink. The routine of homework and dinner and bedtime stories. He'd once decided who lived and who disappeared with a signature. Now his biggest decisions were whether dinosaur nuggets or regular nuggets, and if 30 minutes of screen time was negotiable on weekends. Papa, you're staring again, Zara said, tilting her head. Are you sad? No, sweetheart. Just thinking. About what? About how I almost missed this. About the man I was and the man I'm trying to be. About redemption and second chances and whether someone like me deserves either. About how lucky I am. he said instead, which was also true. Zara considered this, then nodded sagely. Because you have me. Exactly because I have you. She beamed, then went back to her cereal, crisis averted. Later, after dropping Zara at school, where she ran off without looking back, completely secure in the knowledge he'd return, Jayam stood in the parking lot watching other parents navigate their ordinary mornings. Once he'd ruled through fear. His name had been whispered in back rooms and underground networks. The 23rd floor had been a fortress where even his own men entered with caution, where silence meant power and isolation meant safety. Now his daughter burst into his office shouting, "Papa!" without knocking, leaving sticky handprints on everything and demanding his attention for stories about playground politics and lost teeth and friendship bracelets. The door was always open. The laughter had replaced gunfire. And somehow, impossibly, this felt more powerful than anything he'd built before. Because this he'd chosen. Not inherited, not taken by force, not maintained through fear. He'd chosen to dismantle an empire. Chosen to walk away from power. Chosen to become someone new. Blood didn't make family. Choice did. Zara hadn't been born into his world. She'd crawled into it, called him Papa, and given him a reason to burn everything down and start over. That evening, helping with homework at the kitchen table while Amina prepped dinner, Zara looked up from her worksheet. "Papa. I love you." 3 words. Simple. Absolute. They meant more than any title Seoul's underworld had ever given him. "I love you too, Flower." She went back to coloring, already distracted by something else, while Jayam sat there feeling the weight and wonder of those words. He'd been called many things. The silent boss, the shadow of Seoul, the man who ruled fear itself. But sitting there, in a modest kitchen in Busan, with crayon marks on his shirt and his daughter's hand reaching for his, Papa was the only title that had ever truly mattered.